I said I'm not afraid anymore! Do you hear me? I'm not afraid anymore!
How do you follow up on a game that was so popular and so good? Now, some games have done brilliantly, like Arkham City, Gears of War 2, and more recently Star Wars Jedi Survivor, all fantastic sequels that grew on its foundation from the original without really losing anything. Some fall and fall hard, however, like Dawn of War 3, Gears of War 5, and Metal Gear Solid Survive.
So I guess old Hanky Panky wasn't enough for you, huh?
It wasn't for me.
Well, after the success of Shadow of Mordor, Monolith Productions give us Shadow of War, a obvious sequel in their Lord of the Rings universe that does things bigger and better and more over the top than the first game. We've got armor and weapons to swap out, armies and outposts to control, and more of Mordor to explore. And yes, it is a pretty good sequel, but sadly I think it loses some of its charm.
Hey! Give me some eyes! Look at me! Cool your jets! Alright, beat it!
But firstly, what is Shadow of War and what's it about? Releasing back in 2017, Shadow of War continues the story of Talion the Gondor Ranger and Celebrimbor the Elven Smith who created the One Ring as they create a new ring to rival Sauron's one.
New card. What do you think?
Whoa, very nice.
Picking up right where the last game finished with Talion wanting to create a ring to rival Sauron's one, Talion creates the new ring right at the start of the game in the fires of Mount Doom, and immediately after this, Celebrimbor is abducted by Shelob, the giant spider, who in this game can turn into a goth babe.
Nice.
Now, we trade the ring that we've just made for Celebrimbor's return, and we set out to save the nearby Gondor city of Minas Ithil, which is under siege by the armies of Mordor. Now, this city holds the Palantir, and obviously Sauron wants it, so he sends in this game's main villain, the Nazgul and the Witch King of Angmar. Now, Minas Ithil and its surrounding area works like a bit of a tutorial for the game of how to play it and remembering the controls and reintroducing yourself to the game mechanics. But spoiler alert, but it's also the opening act of the game, but we lose the city to the Witch King, Sauron gets the Palantir, and the city becomes Minas Morgul, the Witch King's fortress that we see in the films.
I am shocked! Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
And with the Palantir, Sauron can see that Shelob has the new ring that Talion and Celebrimbor created to face off against him. So, Sauron sends the Nazgul to go and get it from Shelob. And we end up getting our ring back from her because Shelob doesn't like the attention that she's been getting from Sauron, and then we set out to create our own army to fight off against Sauron.
You know you're infringing on my right to celebrate new holidays.
That's not a right.
Well, it's going to be.
Now, gameplay-wise, Shadow of War does the same thing as Shadow of Mordor, but it gives us some more refined mechanics here and there, a heap of new abilities, a new talent tree, areas to explore, fortresses to siege and defend, and we get to ride drakes, which comes in handy with some of the map sizes. The core combat and stealth is the same as Shadow of Mordor. You'll have sneaking moments where you'll need to hide in bushes and climb towers and stealth kill enemies, a bit like Assassin's Creed. Now, we do have some new abilities like being able to summon followers or to command a companion in missions to assassinate enemies or even summon a mount, and it kinda works and it kinda doesn't work at the same time. Like when you're commanding an ally to go kill another orc, other orcs and other NPCs don't really seem to care or notice that someone's being assassinated out in the open, but if I'm doing it Italian, all hell breaks loose. We can also daisy chain our executions in this game too, where Celebrimbor's Wraith will come out of Talion and continue to execute enemies at the cost of our focus bar. Speaking of the focus bar, our ranged combat does return with Celebrimbor's bow and arrow, as well as the Wraith Vision, which is basically this game's version of the Detective Vision from the Arkham series, and, well, that's what it is really. Obviously, it does come in handy with spotting orcs or war chiefs around the map, as well as highlighting any wildlife that might be hiding around to mess you up. Like previous games too, we can also see details about orc captains with their names, their strengths and weaknesses, which comes back to the amazing Nemesis system. But if you do get caught sneaking around or an orc captain tracks you down, which yes, was new to me and I completely forgot about it, and it was very, very annoying, you'll either be forced to run or to fight. Now, the combat is still the same as it was in the previous games, and it's basically the Arkham games with swords. We do have some changes though. In Shadow of Mordor, executions could be performed on combos, so if you had say a 8-hit combo, then you could perform an instant execution. Here in Shadow of War, during combat you'll fill this meter, and then when it's full or halfway full, you can then do an instant execution. You can do the Wraith Flash, which is an area of attack damage, stunning people around you, or you can instantly brand orcs to fight on your side. Now when we get the new ring back from Shelob, we can go around mind controlling orcs to fight for us, but here it is a little different. While yes, we can simply sneak up behind an orc and use our built up combat meter to instantly brand them, we can also sneak into an area, mind control all the archers and then command them to attack, which is pretty cool. A new feature too is also giving us a bodyguard.
You know what you should do, is make that bloke your bodyguard. Anyone looking to carve his way across Mordor needs a guard or two. I mean, I don't. But obviously, if it ever got to the point where I needed a hand on the battlefield, I'd cut my own throat. But you should have some added muscle, no shame in it.
Now where in previous games war chiefs or captains had bodyguards, here in Shadow of War we can brainwash a captain and make them our bodyguard, and we can summon them if we're stuck in battle or we need a hand, but just like you'd expect, if your bodyguard dies, they're out and they're dead. Shadow of War also gives us a new super ability called Elven Rage, where Celebrimbor slows down time, creates a heap of wraith versions of himself, and immediately starts firing arrows at enemies, dealing some pretty good damage. Now, it was an ability I tend to sort of forget about here and there though, but it worked wonders when having to take on a war chief inside of a fortress. But what Shadow of War gives us as well is the fortress sieges. For you see, each state or area or province or whatever you want to call it has a fortress commanded by a powerful war chief and is protected by captains who provide special abilities or perks to the fortress. Some captains might provide a buff to the fortress like fire flowing from its walls or providing stronger Uruks defending the castle. All of these buffs with the captain and the war chief provide you with a fortress level, which is used to tell you how hard it is to assault the fortress. Now with any captains that you mind control, you can then assemble a siege crew to take over the fortress. And from the siege menu, you can see your siege level, followed by the fortress level, so you can get an idea of whether you should attack the fortress now, increase your own forces, or take out any captains to lower the fortress you're attacking's level. Now, just like how fortresses have buffs, your offenses and your siege force can be upgraded too, such as giving your captains a squad of cave trolls, or using Caragor riders or archers with better range and accuracy, even a wargraug and siege beasts. Now, when you've got enough of a force, you can then begin your assault on the fortress with this cool little introduction cutscene playing out. From here, you'll face off against any forces that the fortress has, like any captains that you didn't mind control or kill, general archers, and sort of the combat sort of in general, really. But you'll have this little bit of a battlefront moment of gameplay where you'll need to capture and control points of interest throughout the fortress, basically taking over the city. Once you've captured all control points, you'll then control the main city, but you'll need to challenge the war chief who will be hiding inside of their throne room. And this will be a bit of a boss fight and have different variables like fire coming out of the floor or tougher enemies around them. And once you've defeated this war chief, the fortress is then yours. From there, you can choose to promote a captain that you control to war chief of that fortress and make any upgrades yourself like firewalls and such. But you also need to defend this fortress from any Uruks out there that you don't control, as they'll want to take the fortress for themselves. On top of this, Uruks can turn on you and you don't know who will turn or when.
There was a certain pleasure in serving you, but there are so many other things I can do with you to derive pleasure.
But you can't do this to me.
And the game slowly turns into spinning plates if you're managing multiple fortresses, Uruks who can turn on you at the drop of a hat, or a bodyguard that you love dying because you forgot that they're weak to fire and a drake sets them on fire. But with fortresses, new abilities and a new story, there come new missions. And Shadow of War gives you too many side quests and stories to follow, and that's where I think Shadow of War, as I mentioned before, starts to lose its charm. The story of the previous game, Shadow of Mordor, was simple enough. Revenge. Talion wanting to find out and get some memories of who Celebrimbor is, and Talion wanting to get revenge on Sauron's goons who murdered him and his family. It's pretty straightforward, it doesn't need to be more complex than that. This game, however, starts off immediately with Celebrimbor being kidnapped by Shelob, and we're dropped straight into the game. And maybe after being spoiled from previous games like Gears of War 2, Arkham City and Jedi Survivor, having a anticipated sequel start off with a great slow introduction before, becoming Batman or we get our lightsabers back, I think would have been a good move here. Where after Celebrimbor has been kidnapped by Shelob, we're just dropped straight into a lair. Then from here we're doing missions where we chase a Balrog around Mordor and we take on a Necromancer. We have to fight and save the warriors of Gondor, we need to do missions for Shelob, and I found myself getting a bit bored. I think Shadow of War doesn't have a main core story, but instead has multiple missions with multiple storylines, and some of them are kinda eh. For example, the story missions with the Balrog and the Necromancer. The only reasons I did these missions was the reward at the end of the mission chain was the ability to summon a Drake mount, and why wouldn't I want to summon my own personal dragon?
We are flying!
Shadow of War 2 also lets us customize Talion with his armor and his weapons, and while yeah, it is cool to some extent, I found it ruined a bit of the identity of Talion. Now, what I mean by that is we can change Talion's armor, his cape, his bow, his sword and his dagger, and it allows us to change the stats and buffs as well. These changes too also physically change what Talion looks like, so being a fan of Rohan being able to use their armor and weapons was kinda cool, sure. But Talion as a character has a connection or a relationship to his gear. His sword it's his sword, and the bow that we can change out is Celebrimbor's bow, who was a wraith and it's an old elvish bow, so it sort of works as a connection to Celebrimbor. Talion's cape and gear was damaged and tattered when he faced off and died against the Black Hand of Sauron, but most importantly, Talion's dagger is his son's broken sword, and being able to change out an important sentimental weapon like that seems kinda weird, at least to me. With having new gear to wear, another annoying thing, and this one's probably a bit more personal, but Talion's gear doesn't change during cutscenes, and which any time a game lets us change out outfits or clothes or armor, but it doesn't update in the cutscenes, it annoys the fuck out of me. Now, I can understand if it was a cutscene that was like super high rendered like the cinematics you see in the World of Warcraft games, but the game graphics and the cutscene graphics look the same. And there are even some in-game cutscenes here and there where we're wearing our gear, and then 2 seconds later it's another cutscene, and we're wearing the general sort of generic Talion outfit. Still staying on gear, but Talion's cloak or cape, they look like they've been made out of cardboard sometimes. They feel very stiff in some instances, and this wasn't an issue I had with Shadow of Mordor. So I decided to have a bit of a Google, and I found that the issue was relating to the frame rate. And if the frame rate is set to 30 frames per second, Talion's cloak and hair will move around naturally. If you set it to anything higher, the hair doesn't move and the cape flows as if it's made from cardboard. Now, these are some of the issues that I had with Shadow of War, and you may not have had any of these problems. Chatting with my mate Dantix, who loves these games, he didn't have any of these problems, and Shadow of War is definitely a game that you should check out, especially if you enjoyed Shadow of Mordor.
No shit.
Mainly though, what surprisingly didn't work for me was the ending and the wrap up of the game. So, warning, I will be going into some story spoilers here, and if you want to skip these spoilers, please go to the timestamp on screen now. After we've captured all of the fortresses in Mordor and we've faced off against countless Nazgul, we rally her orc army and charge the fortress of Barad-dûr to take out Sauron. We face off against Isildur, who has become a Nazgul, which isn't part of the Lord of the Rings canon, thank you Miranda for confirming, but we manage to get Isildur to drop his Ring of Power and then we free his spirit. Following this though, Celebrimbor turns and betrays Talion, as Talion catches on that Celebrimbor wants to rule, not destroy Sauron.
Do we need to talk?
I think you've done a lot more than talk. You betrayed me.
All right, I admit it.
So Celebrimbor goes with Eltariel, an elf who's been hunting the Nazgul as ordered by Galadriel, which means Talion's sliced neck starts to reappear from when he died at the start of the first game, and he starts to bleed out. Celebrimbor and Sauron face off, and the fight ends with Sauron and Celebrimbor ending in a stalemate with each other, and Barad-dûr's tower is completed with Sauron's eye flashing blue here and there from this constant struggle. But anyways, goth mummy Shelob appears as a vision, and Talion finds a way to contain the forces of Sauron within the borders of Mordor by putting on Isildur's Ring of Power, making Talion a Nazgul. And while yes, he is a Nazgul, he fights the constant corruption of the ring and refuses to become one of the Nine for as long as he can. Now, this is obviously outside of the Lord of the Rings canon, but that didn't overly bother me if I'm honest. But this is a great place to stop the game and have it end on a cliffhanger for a third and final game. If the game ended with Celebrimbor leaving Talion for Eltariel to face off against Sauron, and Talion puts on Isildur's ring and becomes a Nazgul, imagine that's the ending of the game. We could have had a story then with Talion wanting to get revenge on Celebrimbor and stopping him from taking control of Middle-earth. The forces and friends of Gondor that Talion had made during the events of the two games would then become enemies, as Talion is now one of the Nine. We could have sided with Sauron and his forces to, yes, not only stop Celebrimbor, but to track down Eltariel, who is now linked with Celebrimbor, taking us outside of Mordor. Imagine that for character development, going from a Gondor ranger who's wanting revenge, to wanting to take out Sauron, to then working with Sauron to stop someone else who's probably just going to be as worse as Sauron, if not even more so worse. Imagine playing as a Nazgul going into the forests of Mirkwood or Rohan, or into the mountains, and shit, even Erebor could have been a great location to go to, and we could have had famous and familiar fortresses to capture and hold. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to hold something like, say, Minas Tirith, but we could have held something like Helm's Deep or the city of Dale right outside of Erebor. Having new enemies to face off against, like dwarves and elves and the Riders of Rohan, being a Nazgul could have given us completely new abilities and new different mounts to use and weapons, and let us visit the rest of Middle-earth. This third game could have ended with us travelling to the Shire after torturing Gollum for the whereabouts of the One Ring. Instead though, the game wraps up with Talion holding Sauron's army within Mordor's borders for 60 odd years, and we do this by defending fortresses that we've captured, which is the epilogue of the game, and it's just tower defense. The game's ending is, say, a bit like Arkham Knight, where the main story is over, but if you want to get the good ending, then you need to do these side missions after the main story is sort of done. But Arkham Knight made me want to do the side missions, where here in Shadow of War, I wasn't overly invested or interested. And after we've defended the fortresses, we get a cutscene where Talion finally gives in and becomes a member of the Nine. He becomes a Nazgul. And then we get a cutscene of the One Ring being destroyed, Barad-dûr falling, Celebrimbor's spirit pissing off into the wind, and then we see that Talion was the Nazgul that was riding the Fell Beast when Mount Doom erupted. And after this, Talion is properly dead. He gets to lay his weapons down and reunite with his family. Now, the ending of that worked fine, great for retiring the character, sure, but this felt like a game that was going to get a third entry of a series, and what I just mentioned for an off-the-cuff idea for a third game, I think would have been a banger.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but that's not a bad idea.
But Shadow of War does some great things. We've got more areas of Mordor to explore with loads of different environments, from snow, desert, grasslands, and it's all pretty cool to explore areas of Mordor that we never saw in the films. The Uruks are better than they are in the previous game, and we now have Ulogs, which are those basic cave troll style of enemies. The voice acting, the character names, the perks and nerfs with each character always had me in stitches.
Douche.
Some characters had me laughing while others could smell and track me down, which was challenging as it went against my stealth gameplay style. The world design is the same merge between Peter Jackson's world and artist's interpretation. The Nazgul look like a mixture of their designs in Lord of the Rings and their appearance in the Hobbit films, which I actually don't think the Hobbit films are that bad, the extendeds are better than the normal ones. But anyways, the world of Mordor and its new locations look like the art and design team had a lot of fun, and I won't lie, if I was on that design team, I'd have a lot of fun too. The combat is smooth, the stealth is enjoyable, and the Uruks and Orcs in the game are nothing short of fantastic. And I love how Bruce is basically the equivalent of the local that you see down at the Aussie pub. He's super friendly, he's funny, but he's completely frightening if you get on his bad side.
Always said you were an optimist. Know what that is, mate? It's about sizing up a situation that's bloody impossible and saying, yeah, alright, I'll have a go.
While some of these story plot points weren't overly my jam, there weren't many missions that I didn't enjoy. See, I feel for these games a good story will keep me invested and keep me glued to the game, and while some missions did have a good story, the Canaan missions didn't, but I did enjoy how Monolith created each mission and challenge, and some of them had me stop and think of a way to tackle them, especially that last Canaan mission. Shadow of War keeps you hooked on the spinning plates that is capturing and holding fortresses, putting time into leveling up your captains and war chiefs, and spending in-game currency that cannot be purchased with real money to upgrade your siege fortresses, to upgrade your fortress, or to give orders and training upgrades to your Uruks to level and buff them up. It then becomes a bit heartbreaking when you've got an Uruk that you love and that you've put time and money into, and they turn on you. Or when you're literally walking to the mission starter to start assaulting a fortress, and your siege captain turns on you, and if you kill them, your assault forces might not be strong enough to take on the fortress, which happened to me a few times.
Stay back! Pack it in, Frank, you silly bastard!
But should you play Shadow of War? Well, yes, it's a fun game. It looks great in 4K besides the cape issues on PC.
Tuka.
And as a back-to-back session with Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, you're in for a good time. I do have some personal issues with this entry in the series, but you guys might not have this problem. There are loads of wicked YouTube channels available of people playing Shadow of War and messing around with the orcs, having created some fantastic rivalries, and seeing what happens if you as Talion die to a lowly slave orc and watching them rise through the ranks. Monolith haven't released a game as well since Shadow of War and are currently working on a Wonder Woman game using their Nemesis system. Now, this system works great for Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor, being built around dying into that enemy or goon getting stronger as they've killed you. They get a bit of a reputation. I don't know how that's going to work for a Wonder Woman game, but I am interested to see it. But anyways, if you've not played the Shadow of Mordor or Shadow of War games, you'll want to check them out. They're visually stunning, the voice acting and music is brilliant, the attention to detail, the design of the characters in the world, the overall game will make any Lord of the Rings fan smile. But whether you've just found the world of Middle-earth, or you've been asking yourself for years where were Gondor when the Westfold fell, always remember to play with each other and play with yourself.